A very good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar on data visualization and presentation for financial analysts. This webinar is going to be presented by Danielle Stein-Fairhurst. Before we start, I would like to take you through a few details that will be of benefit to you. These are some housekeeping points. The slides will be available on our SlideShare page, and about 2 weeks after the webinar, we will email the link to you. Likewise, the recording of this webinar will also be available for you to download. We will email the link to you. After the webinar, there will be a survey that will pop up at the end. Please do take the time to complete this for us. As and when you have questions coming up in your mind throughout the session, please feel free to type them onto the questions box or the chat box, and time will be allocated at the end of the webinar for the speaker to address your questions. It's time now for me to introduce you to Danielle Stein-Fairhurst, your presenter for today. Well, Danielle has been with Informa for a long time now, and she runs her own consultancy based in Sydney. She has over 14 years of experience in various industries as an analyst, and she will, of course, tell you a little bit about herself as well. She is also the author of a book called Using Excel for Business Analysis, which is part of the Wiley Finance series. Over to you now, Danielle, and I hope you all enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mega. It's always really nice to come to Dubai. I always enjoy my time here. I just arrived here on Saturday afternoon after a very long flight from Sydney. We're just getting into winter in Sydney, and it's always nice to come over here to the sunshine. And I arrived here on Saturday afternoon, and on Sunday I started our financial modelling using Excel certificate in financial modelling from George Washington University, which is a 5-day training course that we run here in Dubai. I think we run it it's about 3 times a year, isn't it, Mega? So I always enjoyed doing that. That's lots of fun. I get around quite a lot, so it's always nice to come over here. So, okay. What you see here is just a slide from my book. This is the book that you receive as part of my training courses. I'll be referring to some of the content from that book. Now, I've actually given you a copy. I'm going to go through a little bit of stuff in Excel. I find it very hard to do any kind of training or presentations without referring to Excel at least a little bit, and I think it would be a lot easier for you guys if you're able to follow along and have a copy of the file that I'm going to be using today. So I've actually popped that into the webinar box. I hope that you are able to receive that. It's called Data Visualization, and I've popped it into the webinar box under handouts. So please just, if you can't see that, please let me know. I will make sure that that becomes available to you. Whilst we're going through this on the webinar, you probably just want to follow along in Excel with me. And then you'll be able to look at that later on. So it's always nice to have that for reference. Okay, let's have a look at what we're going to be talking about today. The topic is on data visualization and presentation for financial analysts. So as finance people, we're not always very good at the visualization of our analysis and our financial models. I'm going to talk in terms of financial modeling. Financial modeling is a lot of what I do. Most of the work that I do involves financial models, and often what we have to do is, we spend an awful lot of time on our financial models of, number crunching, making sure the numbers are right. That's the most important thing, of course, is making sure, the accuracy and making sure that the numbers are absolutely accurate. But often, when we finish doing that, we need to then show or communicate the outcome of our presentation to other people, and that's something that's perhaps doesn't always come naturally to financial analysts, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the rise of visualization. So we find that nowadays there's just so much, it's all about the pictures, not about the spreadsheets. I'll talk a little bit about storytelling, about the fact that our brains are better wired for stories rather than numbers or abstract ideas. We'll look at a few ways of making your message or the outcome of your analysis personal rather than just spouting out a pile of numbers, making it relevant for people. And then lastly, we'll talk about using Excel for the purpose of analysis rather than using Excel for the purpose of presentation. So firstly, let's talk about the rise of visualization. If you've noticed in recent years, in social media has just meant that pictures and visuals are just so much more prevalent nowadays. Have you noticed if you go on, Instagram is a good one, but if you go on to, I know if I post something on Facebook, sometimes I play a little game with myself. I post something on Facebook that's just with text, something that's really, really interesting, and then I'll post something really, really boring a little while later, but this time I'll actually add a picture. And guess which post gets the most attention, gets the most people commenting, the most people seeing it? Obviously, it's the one with the picture. People are so used to seeing pictures, and that we get a little bit lazy, I suppose. We're not used to reading or having to analyze or having to think, because the use of visualized information has increased so much, and we're just getting so used to looking at pictures rather than and reading or looking at numbers, and that's something that's just become part of life, part of everyday life nowadays. We receive 5 times as much information now than we did a few years ago. The information that we receive is just so much. We have an absolute information overload. I kind of miss the old days when we used to be able to make a decision. It was kind of easier to make a decision. Before there was the age of TripAdvisor, for example. When you wanted to book a holiday, you just walk into a travel agent and look at a brochure with one picture and decide where you're going to stay. Whereas nowadays it's just so much more difficult because there's so much information available, so much variety, and you spend ages finding a particular place to go or a particular place to stay, and then you find that somebody has something negative to say about it on social media and you think, oh no, I don't want to go there, so you start all over again. So it can make things, makes it much more time-consuming, certainly, to find information and to make decisions. So with this problem of information overload, sometimes some people will shut down. They won't make a decision, or they'll keep open to the flow of information. So being able to deal with that information overload, with the mass amount of information that we have available to us, is the task of a good analyst, is being able to disseminate all of the information that is available to us nowadays. Information, having a way of dealing with all of this information is showing infographics and visuals are really good at countering this problem, because we don't like to read anymore. We get so used to viewing things visually. We might be, doing several things at once. We might be cooking dinner, or we might be on the bus, or heaven forbid, we might just be at the traffic lights, and we might be on the phone or looking at the laptop, and we've got lots of different things vying for our information or our attention. So it's good to show visualizations, because we don't like to read, we like pictures, and we want it now. We want to see it straight away, and that's why visuals are just so popular. And of course, visuals are just a lot more engaging. So I wonder, is the increase of visual information dumbing us down? Is it making us dumber? Is it making us so that we don't have to work anymore? That's something that I think about sometimes. I think, we're making it, we are having to make our analysis, make it so easy, make it so digestible for people. And I think that perhaps sometimes this increase of visual information is meaning that our brains are not having to work so hard. I think it's an interesting question, but as an analyst, you need to deal with that, and you need to think about the fact that people don't want to work for their information. You need to make sure that the information that you present to them is easily digestible and easy to understand. So by using visualization, you can grab your audience's attention and get your point across a lot more easily. When you're presenting financial information, these are the problems that we deal with. As financial analysts, we're used to seeing numbers, we're used to looking at numbers, we're used to financial information. Often the people that we are presenting to don't necessarily have a financial background. Sometimes we don't know the background of the people that we need to present our information to, but often they don't necessarily have the same background as us, and they don't naturally gravitate to numbers. Apparently 85% of managers don't understand the reports that they receive. They receive these reports, they don't bother to look into the detail because they don't understand them, and they don't try to understand them, probably because it's just too much information. Often financial concepts are not necessarily intuitive. Something also to think about, particularly for people who are like me, who are used to looking at Excel. You're used to looking at numbers all day, every day. Other people don't necessarily love Excel as much as we do. Their eyes tend to glaze over when they see grid lines. So probably one of the best things that you can do when you want to show somebody something in Excel is to actually get rid of the grid lines. That's just an easy way to make your presentation look a lot more friendly and a lot more usable for people coming from a non-financial background. So when you have to get across a piece of information, if you need to show somebody the outcome of your analysis, try and think about the story that you want to tell. People respond to pictures. If you need to give a presentation, you should try and turn this into a story. Don't just stand up there and spout a whole lot of data and a whole lot of financials. If they wanted data, you could just email it to them. You don't need to give them a presentation. You should give them a little bit of emotion. Not too much, of course, just a little bit of information. It's not a dirty word. You should be passionate about your message, about what you want to get across. When you're going to put something into a slide, it should not repeat your message. It should reinforce your message. Don't give them the handout or the punchline before the presentation. Give them the presentation and then give them the detail afterwards. Just something that I've learnt, when you go to present the outcome, or if you want to put together a budget, for example, if you give them the budget, the detailed budget straight up at the beginning of the presentation, I just find that you lose people. They spend the whole time poring over the detail and they don't listen to what you have to say. So if you were to present somebody a budget, for example, I would give them the high-level outcome, tell them the story of where you're headed, get them excited about it, tell them this is what we need to do, this is what, we need to approve our budget, and as you conclude, then you give them the detail so that they can look at it afterwards. So that's a much more efficient way of presenting a financial presentation rather than something that's quite boring. Okay, let's look at an example now of, if I had to present, let's say I had to tell you about fatal and non-fatal workplace accidents, and I've got a whole lot of data here, and I've got this in my spreadsheet. I've spent days and days gathering this data and analysing it. I'm terribly proud of this report that I've put together for you. So what I've done is I've just gone and grabbed my spreadsheet and I've dumped it into a PowerPoint slide. Does this grab your attention? Does this tell you a story? I would venture to say that it really doesn't tell you very much, and I think I've probably lost you already. There's no visuals on here. It's actually far too small for you to read. It's really not a very interesting presentation at all, so I certainly wouldn't recommend showing anybody anything that looks like that. What about something like that? That's at least visualization. Again, though, it's not, it's not terribly exciting. It's just a graph. There's far too much information on here. It doesn't really tell me, it doesn't give me a message. It doesn't tell me anything terribly interesting. What about something like that? If I were wanting to tell a story. So this is a visualization of fatal workplace accidents, actually using the same data as what we've just been looking at. And my message here is that men are much more likely to die in workplace accidents. Therefore, we should hire only women because men have much greater accidents than women do. So that's a visualization of it. Not a particularly accurate message because, of course, there's just a lot more men working in the industry rather than women. So it's perhaps a good visualization of the data, but it's certainly not a very good interpretation of the data. What about something like this? Some kind of detail, some words telling me about somebody, a worker, 46 years old, was crushed by a vehicle. That's a little more interesting. Again, it's words and it's reading, but it's a lot more interesting than seeing numbers on the slide. Maybe something like this. Some pictures of real people. Exactly what happened. Telling a story about the people. It makes it a lot more real and it makes it a lot more personal. And then you would perhaps give them some data and some backup behind that. But by picking out a couple of examples and making it personal, you're going to get your message across in a lot better way. So by making it personal, you're going to be able to give your message and tell your story in a much more personal way. Remember that the data is not the main event. You are the main event. Don't rely on your data. Don't rely on the slides or the technology. Particularly with webinars, we know that technology often fails, and sometimes there's not a lot that we can do about that. But if you're in a live presentation, just think about the fact that very often, and this happens, quite commonly, that the projector doesn't work, or the Excel isn't compatible on that laptop, or maybe you can't get the laptop to connect to the projector, or something like that. Lots of things that can go wrong. So just think about that and have an idea of what you're going to say. Don't rely on the slides. Don't rely on the technology. You are the presentation, not the data. Data hasn't got any meaning. There's really no point in just giving lots and lots of numbers and lots of information. You need to give the data some context. So for example, if your target was to sell 120 units and you actually produced or sold 125, everything's good. There's no problem. If we were to actually look at that by give it some context, give it some meaning by comparing it to a benchmark, then it would give us a little bit more context. So let's have a look at some data that looks like that. So you can see here that we're in December and our target was 125. Our target was 120 and we actually produced 125. So whilst you might think that everything's okay, looking at the trend, looking at the story, looking at the context, you can see that perhaps we might be in a little bit of trouble. So as I said here, decision makers need insights, they don't need information. You need to actually give the data some meaning by giving it some context and giving it a little bit of a benchmark. So for example, I'm going to bore you with some financial information now. So we've got 2 years of comparisons of cash flow, we've got opening balance, we've got income, we've got expense. Have I lost you yet? I hope so, because this is really boring, this kind of stuff. Showing financial information like this, even though it's big enough, I mean, you can read it, but it's really not particularly interesting. It would be much more interesting if I were to show something like this. Okay, so here we've got our opening balance of minus $4.8 million. This is where we started out, and then our income was nearly 60,000, and that brought us up to that, and then we've got our expenses, which brought us down to here. Our obligations brought us back down there, and which brought us down to our ending balance there. So that's much more interesting. We can see it step by step, and using a waterfall chart is a great way of displaying cash flows, of looking at things step by step. Much more interesting presentation to look at than just seeing the numbers as they were originally. Okay, let's talk about Excel for a minute. I haven't mentioned Excel for at least 5 minutes, so it must be time to talk about Excel. Excel is an analytical tool. It is not a presentation tool. For goodness sake, do not grab a dump of or a spreadsheet and dump it onto a slide. That is not what Excel is designed to do. Just because you love numbers doesn't mean that they love numbers. Get rid of the grid lines and don't overwhelm them with the numbers. Because if you just show somebody a spreadsheet and a whole lot of information, they'll just get overwhelmed and confused. They won't admit, of course, that they're overwhelmed and confused. They'll just not make decisions, and that's certainly not what we want. Here's an example of a spreadsheet that I've just dumped into a presentation. It's quite boring. I mean, there's a bit of a visual here, but there's just far too much content, far too much information, and I'm really not able to present or to give any kind of information based on this financial model. It'd be much better if I were to summarize the key points, make the chart a little bit bigger, and just show the key points of what the audience really needs to know. When you are going into Excel and running a live model, don't jump around. It's very easy to lose people when you're demonstrating in Excel. Make sure that you test the scenarios, test what you're about to do. Go through things very slowly, much more slowly than you would do when you're on your own. Just pick out the key points that they need to know. Don't embed a spreadsheet onto a slide, and use the numbers to back up your story. So when you put together a presentation, you know, if you were showing the outcome of a financial model, perhaps you've put together a business case or a budget or a feasibility or a cash flow, something like that. The way that you would structure that presentation is perhaps to take them through the model building process. You would say, you know, first I did this and then I did this. It's pretty boring, but it might be appropriate in certain situations. You might want to walk them through the P&L. You'd say, here's our income, here's our expenses, and this is how much profit we expect to get. That's another way of doing it. But make sure that you think about what they actually need to know. Be clear about the outcome of the presentation. Don't just jump around all over the place. Say, okay, we're here today because I'd like you to approve my project. I'd like to go ahead with this, and this is what I'd like you to do, or I'd like you to approve my budget. What is it that you want them to do? Give them the information that they need in order to achieve those outcomes, and don't confuse them or give them anything that's going to sidetrack them and make them talk about other things rather than what it is that you want them to do. Remember, of course, that confused decision makers will not make decisions. They will not admit that they're confused, but they'll just simply talk about everything else and not do what you want them to do. Because when they are presented with an information dump, they'll simply ask for more analysis. They'll say, well, maybe you could look at this, or maybe you could look at that. They're not going to say, well, hey, I didn't really understand what you're saying there. They'll just hope that you'll come back with something more useful. So it's a good idea to give them a roadmap or a clear structure for the presentation as you go through it. Okay, let's talk about a couple of different tools that you could use for Excel. If you for visualization and data analysis. So here's a couple of things I'd like to take you through. I'm going to flick over to Excel now. I'm going to go over to the file. If you've been able to access the file, then you'll be able to follow along with me, or you could just, I'll just demonstrate and you can follow along with what I'm doing here and access the file at a later date. So the first one is a copy of, this is the cash flow that we talked about before. Now, if you've got Excel 2016, you will see that I have created a waterfall chart. Unfortunately, I'm using Excel 2013, and this is something that you really need to think about with different versions of Excel. If you use one of the fancy new features in some of the latest versions of Excel and then find that you have to open it up in a previous version, this is what happens. So you can see here, this chart is not available. So I'm actually opening this in 2013. So you can't see a copy of the waterfall chart that I created, the one that I showed you in the PowerPoint presentation. A waterfall chart is a great way of displaying information, financial information. If you do need to create one in previous versions of Excel, there is actually an article on my blog on waterfall charts. You can have a look at plumsolutions.com.au, and I take you through step by step how to create a waterfall chart using previous versions of Excel. Or if you're using 2016, of course, it's inbuilt, which is fantastic. What we've got here is this is the historical versus the target file that I showed you earlier. The next thing I wanted to show you was a data bar. Quite often, you show information and you think, well, should I show this as a number or should I show it as a chart? So sometimes it's quite nice to go into conditional formatting, go into data bars and show the fill like that. So you can see there I've actually included the total. It might be better to show it as just the revenue. So if I go into here, go into data bar, and then you can see there that actually shows visually, it just adds a bit of visual interest to my numbers. So that's something that you could consider to make your financials a little bit more interesting, is to use the data bar. You might also want to use icons, so using the ticks and the crosses. I don't recommend using the traffic lights because that doesn't work very well for people who are colorblind. Using the red and orange and green colors also, it doesn't print out very well. So you can also go into conditional formatting, go into icon sets and use those here. If you go into manage rules and edit rule, you can go in and show icon only, and that will get rid of the numbers, which I think actually looks quite nice if you wanted to show it like that. Spark lines are a great way of showing data visually. If you highlight some data like that and go to Insert and then go to sparklines. Like that. That just shows some visual representation of the data, which is, I think, just really adds to your financial presentation. So you can also show it as a stacked chart rather than just a line chart. So here's something where you're wanting to decide, what should you invest in? If I were to show this with sparklines, it really just adds a lot more visual interest to what I'm trying to show here. If I were to add a line like that and copy that down, you can see here it just adds so much more meaning to my data. Rather than just showing a whole lot of numbers, to actually add a sparkline really adds to it. The other thing that I quite like as well is showing some color scales. That also adds a lot of visual interest to your data. So just a couple of really simple Excel tools that you can use to make your data look a lot more interesting. Okay. All right. Let's go back to where I was. So we talked about just a couple of Excel tools there. I just wanted to show you a couple of practical things that you can use to make your financial presentation much more visually interesting. So charting, of course, taking data and showing it in a chart, using some of the conditional formatting that we have available to us. I showed you a couple of things with color scales, data bars, and icon sets, which are just a great way of adding that sort of visual element to your otherwise boring black and white numbers. You can highlight duplicates as well with conditional formatting, and of course sparklines are a great way of displaying visual information in a very small space. Just a couple of points on the new charts that are now available in 2016. As an Excel person, I get very excited when a new version of Excel becomes available. And one of the things that I was really looking forward to in Excel 2016 are the new charts. And here are a couple of the new charts that are available. The tree map, which is absolutely fantastic. It's a great way. It's a little bit, I suppose, a little bit like the pie chart, but it just shows a lot more information. It's a great way of displaying hierarchical information. That is a waterfall chart like the one I showed you before, and that's very, very easy to create in 2016. And this is a sunburst, which is very similar to the tree map, but it just shows it visually. It's just quite visually interesting. So those are a few new charts to look forward to. Bear in mind, of course, that if you're going to create this in Excel, you need to make sure that the person has got that version of Excel. Otherwise, they won't be able to open it. As I have shown you in because I'm using 2013, it doesn't work. When you create one of these new charts, you'd need to save it as a picture or PDF it in order for them to see it. So just a bit of a think about which kind of chart type you might want to show. Let's say I wanted to show the difference between 4 different departments and show the sales information. So thinking about the kind of chart that we might want to display. So we could show this as a line chart, which is not a great way of displaying this information because a line chart is usually used for a continuum. So we would normally have a time series across the bottom, and it shows that there's perhaps some sort of a connection between the data points. In this case, there isn't a connection between the points of data, so this would not be a very good display of this information. We could use a radar chart, which also confuses the issue, makes things look a lot more complicated than they need to. This is quite a good representation of our data. It makes it very easy for the user to see. You can very easily compare the 4 different departments. This is also not a bad way of displaying the information as well. I think probably showing it as a bar rather than a column perhaps is a bit more traditional way of looking at it. Showing it as a 3D is just distorts the data and really doesn't, it really confuses things, and showing this is basically a really bad chart, so I definitely wouldn't recommend it. Showing things as data as a pie chart is not too bad. We do like the pie chart, but when you're trying to compare information, showing information as a pie makes it very difficult to compare, so I wouldn't recommend using a pie chart for this kind of information. Okay, what I've got here is a bit of a thought starter, I suppose, on different types of charts. Now, this is something that was provided by Dr. Andrew Abella from the Catholic University of America. It's a great way of thinking about what is it that you're trying to display. So if you decide that you want to put a chart, if you want to show the output of your financial analysis into a chart, and you're trying to decide what would be the best way of displaying that information, have a think about whether it should be comparison, relationship, distribution, or composition. So have a think about which of those kinds of, what is the message? What is the message that you're trying to get across with the data that you want to show? And from that, you can then think about what sort of chart you should be showing. So we can see here that if our purpose, in the example that I just showed you earlier, our purpose was comparison, so therefore showing some kind of a bar chart would be much more relevant. And lastly, just the use of visualization to make sense of messy data. Here's an interesting example. If you have a whole lot of information, you've dumped, a lot of information that you've got from somebody's database and you wanted to make sense of it, just looking at, this is an example of when you're looking at something in Excel, looking at it with grid lines, it's really difficult to compare. It doesn't mean very much to us, but if I just very, very quickly put this into a chart, you can see straight away that suddenly it makes sense. Suddenly you can see a story. You can see what's going on with this information. You can see there that April is really causing a problem. There's, we really need to understand what's going on. There's some kind of an anomaly there, and it can really help us to give us an idea of what's going on with our data. Okay, so just a reminder that you can go to the website and download some of these examples that I've been talking about, and I also have made the exercise file that we've been using available to you, so you can play around with some of that. That is pretty much it. Just as a bit of a recap, the things that we've been talking about were using visualization for data, not using spreadsheets, the fact that we should be telling a story, that our brains are better wired for stories rather than abstract ideas, that we should make it personal, don't just spout numbers, that we should put numbers into perspective to make it relevant, and lastly, that we should be using Excel for the purpose of analysis, not for the purpose of presentation. So that's pretty much it for my presentation for our webinar today. If you've got any questions, I would love to hear from you. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here. Okay, somebody wants to know, could I elaborate a little bit more on emotion? Okay. So what I meant by emotion is that when you're telling a story, when you're presenting something, some kind of financial information that's quite dry, that you should put some passion into it, put a little bit of emotion and make it personal, make it relevant, make the people think about it rather than just spouting a whole lot of numbers. That's what I meant by emotion. I hope that makes sense to you. We have a question about slices. That's a great question. So we can certainly use slices. I didn't go into that, but slices are great if you're using pivot tables, and you can use slices to show different elements. They're great for dashboards. So thanks for bringing that up. That's a really good point. Are there any other questions that you'd like to go over? We have a question about the latest version of Excel. Somebody wants to know to what extent is the latest version of Excel important for visualization? I think it's pretty important actually. Microsoft keeps bringing out lots and lots of new tools. Some of the later modern Excel has got things like Power Pivot, Power Query, Power View, all of these things which are great for analyzing data, for just extracting, for manipulating data, for data visualization as well. Things like, obviously the charts, some of the new charts are great. And they keep bringing out different things. So the slices, for example, are now available on a table rather than just on a pivot table. So they keep adding this new functionality. And of course, as we discussed, it's with the later, if you create one of the new features, you may not realize it's a new feature, and then somebody tries to open it up in a previous version. That can cause a few problems. Somebody asked about providing online courses on Slicer. Yes, we do have online training available. Slicer is more, we actually cover Slicer in, we'll be covering it in the financial modelling course that we're running here this week. Actually, we talked about Slicer yesterday. The delegates that were attending my training here really enjoyed the Slicer. Slicer is more, and pivot tables are more relevant for data analysis and dashboards, which is another course that we run, and we do have online training available as well. Okay, so if there's no other questions, I think that's pretty much it. So we are going to make this recording available to you. The slides are going to be available. They're going to be made available on SlideShare. So Mega will send those through to you together with the recording and also with the Excel file, just in case you weren't able to see that as well. Or that will be available. That's actually available on the webinar already. So thank you so much for your participation today. It was thank you very much for having me, and I hope to see you again soon.